everybody. My name's Dave Messer, and I lead this thing called the Climate Smart Buildings Alliance. Very briefly, what that is, started a couple of years ago where the leadership of EllisDon, RBC, and Mattamy got together and said, hey, we should do something joint to sort of accelerate the industry transition to net zero. We think we know where we want to go, but it's not moving fast enough, so how can we help spur that on? We've been joined by AtkinsRealis, Dialog, CIBC, and WesGroup recently. And as was mentioned, we really do function kind of as this idea of a think and do tank. There's lots of reports and knowledge in this sector about what needs to change. But how can we sort of jump in there and start leading that change ourselves? Government has a role. We're doing lots of work with government, but this is a systems issue, right? We need banks, we need insurers, we need municipalities, and all sorts of people up and down this building chain to move and change kind of in tandem if we want this massive transformation to happen that needs to happen if we're going to hit net zero by 2050. So that's really sort of the driving ethos behind what we're doing. We're focused on three main areas, basically materials, reducing combustion in buildings, and then accelerating retrofit to net zero new builds. And then kind of underneath that, we're launching a number of different projects, which will grow and spin off over different years. I'm going to speak to one of them, but just for background on some of the other stuff we're doing, we're working with NRC on developing a model for lifetime cost and lifetime carbon for Part 3 residential buildings to see how can we optimize building design, especially in this affordability housing crisis, so that we're figuring out ways to make sure people know how we can build buildings so that they are sustainable and that's not seen as being a binary with affordability at the same time. We're working with about 20 insurers on addressing issues around mass timber insurance and how do we create more data and build some of these platforms that we need to normalize insurance, which is a real barrier to that material. We're also working with about 14 companies and organizations in Ottawa around commercial retrofits and how do we support more of those and sort of bring the group of stakeholders around a building together to help improve the incentive, as well as some work around improving the incentive for net zero residential as well. So just broadly, all this stuff we're kind of doing. But the one I want to talk to, that didn't come out right. Today is something called the Responsible Buildings Pact. So I'm sure most folks in the room are aware of this at this type of event, that when it comes to embodied carbon and materials, we have a lot of solutions now. We have about solutions that can relatively affordably reduce embodied carbon in buildings by 40%. But I think the problem is, if you look broadly across the industry, they're not being used. And they're not being used everywhere they could be. In a lot of cases, they're not even being considered. And that's a system challenge, right? Because it goes up and down. It comes down to how different companies work together. It comes out to how we spec projects. It comes out to how people bid. And so we need to think about how can we change this, it's a business issue, it's also a cultural issue. How do we change this industry culture so that the new normal is that we are using these materials? We don't have all the solutions now, but we should be using the solutions we have as the normal thing if we're gonna hit the goals we need to hit. So this is where we came up with this concept of a pact. So there's lots of pacts being used in other parts of the industry and in this industry, frankly. Canadian Plastics Pact is a great example. Whole bunch of big consumer product companies coming together to change packaging all at the same time and working with Walmart. So Walmart can change how their shelving works. And if they're doing it all together, then they can all change plastic waste, and that's the only way it's going to happen. Same sort of idea here, and I think we're building on some things like SE 2050, which is great in that segment, and AIA 2030 as well for architects. But I think, unlike some other things like Concrete Zero, which sort of sets some fixed targets, we want to be something that helps take this beyond the first movers. We need to move beyond pilots so that it becomes the new normal and is much broader than that. So we want to think about how can we create this sort of pre-competitive platform that de-risks change and sort of moves this accountability and this culture shift across the industry for everyone. So this is where we move forward with this idea of the Responsible Buildings Pact. And when we designed this, really, we focused really around the ideas of how can we do something that builds from current business realities and focuses on that broad mainstream of the industry. If you focus on the top 3%, which is all of you, probably, or many of you, that's not going to change the world, right? We need to pull everybody in. And we need to do that in ways that don't put people off and make it easier for people to participate. So how can we focus on that broad mainstream, and how can we focus on that bigger culture shift? So we started working on this with about 20 different organizations last February, developing, going from sort of a white paper I'd written to some more principles on how this could work. And we came down with 3 kind of core commitments under this pact. So first is companies that are joining agree to stay educated on lower carbon materials. Second, they agree to put in place a process to consistently consider and either use or advocate for, depending on your role in that chain, whether you're, if you're a designer or a contractor versus an owner. You'll either use or advocate for lower carbon materials or designs if there's comparable cost, performance, and availability. There's lots of good reasons to not use lower carbon materials, but when there are good reasons to use them, you should recommend your client use them. And then the last thing is to track and publicly report on the outcomes of that consideration process. And I think this is important because this is creating an accountability metric. And there's lots of things in this industry focusing at the project level, getting your LEED Platinum on that project. There's lots of things focusing on the individual professional. This is focused on the company level. So as your standard business practice for the company, you're going to put in this process, and you're going to do it every time, and you're going to report on that you're doing this process. And we're in the process right now of finalizing what the reporting looks like. But I mean, effectively, if you're saying we did 10 projects last year, we ran them through this analysis process, 7 of them, we were able to use lower carbon materials, the lower carbon designs. 3 of them we weren't because of availability or affordability or whatever, right? And that's okay. The goal is not perfection. The goal is continuous improvement and getting everybody to continuously considering and seeing how can we do better on this and keep this roadmap going. So we launched this at the CIBC conference in last June with 20 signatories. We've now grown to 37. And this year is really a pilot for this, especially if you're thinking about some of the big companies that are members, which you'll see in the next slide. We're focusing right now just in putting these processes on 5 projects in companies and then reporting on that by March of this year. We're also just focusing on concrete for this current year, because that's easy, it's big, but that's going to expand. So next year, I think it's going to be concrete and steel. Next year after that, we'll move on to more materials as we sort of figure this out as we go. And if anybody's interested in joining, participation is voluntary. It's at this point, because we're in the pilot, it's non-binding, there's no cost. So it's low bar of entry. And these are the folks who have joined up with us so far. And I think what makes this kind of interesting compared to some of the other pacts that are out there in the space is that we're stretching across the chain. So we have developers down to the contractors they work with and the consultants who are in the middle. And part of the goal here is hopefully that we get everyone speaking the same language and creating a more openness to take ideas as they move. I mean, EllisDon, for instance, has challenges when they get a project so far down the line. If they have ideas to influence it, it's a challenge for them to do it. But with the pacts, they're committing that, we're going to do that up the way through regardless. And then we're going to report on how we do that. And it's also creating some hopefully unique ways to share best practices and share ideas across these different layers on how we can put these processes in place and think a little more strategically about how we go forward. So one example of that is this. This is a concrete bid template that EllisDon developed last year for some hospital projects where they wanted to focus on a target GHG reduction in their concrete. So I mean, it goes out to the vendors like this. There's the spec on the one side, then it'll either be one mix or 2 mixes where they're targeting, a 20% reduction in concrete emissions, 30% reduction, et cetera, with, using this as a format to identify this has additional costs, this has performance impacts, et cetera, et cetera. Not really that revolutionary, but EllisDon has had a lot of success switching to this type of format when they go out to their vendors. Pass this on to Mattamy. Mattamy put this into one of their projects in Calgary. Just by changing their bid template and going out to vendors, they were able to reduce emissions from concrete by 21% with a nominal increase in cost. Dialog's using a similar type of sheet, RGSs as well. And so this is, if you want to download these are available on our Pact, the Pact. There's a resource hub website. You can find it connected through us. If anyone wants to use this. So every company, every contractor and builder has a concrete bid template. We should probably all use a smarter one that actually connects to carbon, and we can all do it together. So these are some of those little stupid things we can try and solve, which when we add them up, will lead to more transformative change. So that is the gist of what we're doing. If you're interested in getting involved or joining, my email is there, or you can find me through our website at buildingsalliance.ca/pact. Thank you so much.